the cloud. So we're off. Absolutely warm welcome to everybody on the call. Thank you so much for joining us, and a special warm welcome to Emma and to Tom. And I really hope you're going to find our talk interesting tonight. I think maybe we owe the audience an apology before we start for underselling tonight's talk. Partly due to the modesty of one of the speakers. If I find how he described himself, Tom is a semi-retired low-temperature physicist with a background in developing closed-cycle cooling systems for infrared astronomy and Earth observation. Well, I wouldn't have said that. I would have said he is a legend in the world of cryogenics, and there's just a handful of people who could do what he has done in developing cryocoolers for applications in space. And I have to say, it was a masterstroke by Bennaman to hire him when he was nearing the end of his career as head of cryogenics in Rutherford Appleton Lab. So Emma, am I out of turn of what I'm saying there? Is that...
You're absolutely spot on, John. He's the most humble person out there, but he is an absolute world leader in his field, and we bagged him at just the right moment.
So the Hannies don't really know what they've got in their midst.
They don't.
So, hey, absolutely fantastic to have you here tonight to give this talk. And I think the folks want to hear from you, not from me. So who's going to start?
That'll be me. I'm going to be Emma's glamorous assistant for the evening. So. Okay, so if I show my screen. Right. I hope you can all hear that. And see that. Right. Talk tonight is going to be in two parts. I'm going to do a little bit of some science and the rationale and why this firm called Bennaman is in Cornwall. And then Emma's going to give a talk to us about the Bennaman story and a bit more background and the economics, what it does. Now, Bennaman itself is based in Cornwall. And it's a firm set up to address green issues, and we're based in Newquay and near Truro in Cornwall. Most delightful part of the world. It's a growing firm with engineers, workshop, analysis tools, etc. And what we're doing there is trying to change the economics particularly for farmers, particularly on dairy farms. And Cornwall is a particularly difficult area. It's got many dairy farms. It's got many restaurants. You know, Rick Stein is based in Padstow. He owns most of Padstow. But those, generally, because of the poor natural gas infrastructure there, they use propane, for example. And, you know, that's getting very expensive. And a lot of them are looking to use alternative sources because it's cheaper. So climate change, I mean, oh God, this is really, really, really complicated, and I'm oversimplifying everything here just with a potted description of what it is, because everybody knows about sort of the global warming and the methane thing. And this is a familiar hockey stick graph. You can see on the right-hand side here over more recent years. It's done here from about 1850, and of course that's the sort of start of the Industrial Revolution. You know, when factories and potteries, etc., started belching out fumes. And this is the global surface temperature as observed over the years from 1850 to 2020 on this right-hand scale here. Now, you can simulate these things. You can obviously say, well, what would the temperature be if there were no man-made involvement in the chemistry. And this is this bottom line here. So you could see that things would generally chug along as they always have done, you know. But obviously we've got this hockey stick here on our right-hand screen, on the right-hand graph there. Now the left-hand graph goes back even further, and what this does here is we're looking here at reconstructed global temperatures. This grey line that we've got here. Now, how does that? You know, obviously we're making really big changes to our lifestyles and hopefully to our lifestyles and to the way we use energy and greenhouse gases. But you know, that's predicated on this data that's reconstructed from many years ago. So what is the greenhouse effect? Well, you know, we all have greenhouses, but it doesn't work quite like a greenhouse does, but almost. The Earth's atmosphere really is quite transparent to light. So it's more transparent to light than it is to thermal radiation. So the sun burns in one corner here, and the light hits the Earth, warms it up, and that re-radiates energy out. Now, if we didn't have any greenhouse gases, the Earth would cool and we would end up in an ice age. We would be frozen. We do need some sort of greenhouse gases to keep the balance right, and it's all a question of balance. Now, I'm really simplifying things here, so I will accept any criticism about this. But in the upper atmosphere, you collect gases like CO2, methane, nitrogen oxides, and aerosols. And we all know quite a lot about aerosols because they were responsible for degradation in the ozone layer, particularly in the southern hemisphere, to a lesser extent in the northern hemisphere. Now, light coming in can get reflected by clouds in the upper atmosphere as well. So it's all part of this balance. And you know, by doing this, by the industrialization of the globe, we've actually upset this balance in many ways. So greenhouse gases, you hear an awful lot in the literature about GWP, which is global warming potential. I mean, this is basically it's the amount of heat absorbed by a gas per kilogram compared to carbon dioxide. That's important. So if you have carbon dioxide and methane up in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide has a unit of 1. All the other greenhouse gases have multipliers on that, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. So the greenhouse gases depends on the lifetime of the gas. So it's commonly prefixed by the time frame, and it's an indicator of the harm that the gas can cause. So methane, for example, hangs around in the upper atmosphere with a lifetime of, I don't know, 20-25 years, I believe it is. So if we look at the sort of the greenhouse molecules, that are responsible for global warming, why are they more important than other gases like hydrogen and carbon monoxide? Well, the reason is that these gases are a bit more complicated, and carbon dioxide is methane. Now, if I hope you can see my little vignette in the corner of your screen, being the speaker, but carbon dioxide, you think of a mass, a spring, and an oxygen atom. So you've got carbon, spring, oxygen atom, carbon, spring, oxygen atom, two sides. So it's quite complicated. If you think you've got the oxygen atoms can go like that, they can go like that. They've got many complicated modes. Now, if you've got infrared radiation coming through, which is a thermal radiation, it will absorb at those frequencies. So if you've got a gas that's very complicated with lots of different vibrational modes, such as methane, then it will absorb more energy. Okay, that's compared to simple molecules like hydrogen or carbon monoxide, which are just two little oscillators, which will absorb very little infrared radiation. So the simple molecules are more transparent to infrared radiation and less responsible for the greenhouse effect. Whereas more complicated molecules like carbon dioxide and methane actually absorb the energy and give us this thermal blanket over the Earth, which traps in the heat. So on this basis, carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1, as previously defined. In comparison, methane has one of 86, and nitrous oxide one of 265. Now, there isn't a massive amount of nitrous oxide, but there is quite a lot of methane. So its effect is really quite severe in terms of greenhouse warming. If we go on a bit then, this is a table of just some of the gases: carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. And over 20 years, over 100 years, and the lifetime here. So methane in the upper atmosphere has a lifetime of around about 12 years. Carbon dioxide stays in forever. Nitrous oxide, 121 years, so it's quite long-lived. So over 20 years, now the 20-year figure is one that's most often quoted. I mean, that's basically because we've got to do something within 20 years, otherwise we're doomed, basically. So the 100-year figure is a little academic, but there we go. Now, these are figures from the most recent IPCC report. Now, it really is worth looking that up on, just Googling and having a read of it. It's very accessible. There's an awful lot of information there. It's very quite well read. I was listening on the radio the other day about a doctor who was looking at replacing the propellants in asthma inhalers, because that has a 100-year global warming potential of between 1,000 and 3,000, and is actually, on the scale of things, because of this large figure, is significant. And they're trying to move people from $23,500 and a lifetime of about 100 years, of 3,200 years. Now, where do you find SF6? Well, in switchgear, and you get a lot of switchgear in wind turbine farms as well, which is a bit annoying because they're supposed to be very green, and they can have the opposite effect. Okay, but read the IPCC reports; they're very good, actually. From them. Now, what were the sources from of the methane? Well, the United Nations Environmental Programme has actually quantified these figures, and this is also a very good read, and it's worth looking up. This guy at the bottom left really looks a culprit. He looks really suspicious to me, and indeed he is, because agriculture is 40% of the methane emissions. I mean, that's surprising, because there's been a lot in the news about oil and gas fields leaking methane into the upper atmosphere, and more recent data from the Tropomi instrument on the Sentinel satellites, has actually mapped that globally for the past few years. So it's agriculture is really quite a big thing. Waste is another one from landfill sites. Okay, fugitive methane. Well, what is fugitive methane? Well, it's methane that escapes from captivity. So you have cow poo. The culprits over here eat the grass. They do what comes naturally. And what does a farmer do with that? Well, the farmer just dumps it into a big lagoon, conventionally. And this is a picture of one, and it's massive. And this is bubbling away here, releasing methane and escapes into the atmosphere. But methane is a fuel. I mean, it's North Sea gas. What comes out of your you use for cooking with. It's exactly the same stuff. But it's also a fuel that can be used to power vehicles. More importantly, is that we're using diesel. It can replace diesel. You can run a diesel engine off methane with a small amount of modification. So the existing sort of equipment infrastructure itself is actually quite well suited for this. Emma will describe other ways that the methane can be used locally as well. It's also it is a store of energy as well, and I'll explain how that happens. So this is the cycle, really, if you like. So you have grass, it grows, the sun comes down, energy comes up. If you take over a year, 1 square meter has the same of grass will produce the same energy as a liter of petrol. So you can see it's a very significant resource there that's just being lost. So our rather sad-looking cow here eats the grass, does what comes naturally, which then goes into a covered slurry lagoon, and this produces biogas. I'll explain what biogas is in a minute. This is then processed to give us the biomethane, which is then stored. Now, the storage is interesting here because you can either store it as compressed gas or as liquid. Now, if obviously the processing requires power, but if you take that power off peak from wind turbines, when or solar, when they're available, process the methane into a liquid form, then that's a battery. You just release it whenever you need it, and that could be used to level. Most of the world's problem in terms of energy isn't actually producing the energy itself; it's storage. You don't get any power when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. I mean, it's these sort of issues that we need to sort of address. Okay, so slurry lagoons on dairy farms act as a collector and a concentrator of waste biomass. Okay, now this recent legislation is coming in where it's going to say that all lagoons have to be covered. And we'll explain a bit more about that, and also a bit more about the economics. But a typical dairy farm produces 6 times more methane than it can use. So one of the business models is to collect, sell, and share the profit with the farmer. A gas tractor running on fugitive methane can take the equivalent of 680 cars off the road annually. Interestingly, a typical 150-head dairy farm produces 40,000 kilograms of methane, which is worth about £40,000 retail. Now, it really is a sad fact. And when you next go to the supermarket, a farmer can earn more from the cow poo than he can from selling milk. Which, milk really is a premium product, and we get it for buttons. So you should cherish that pinter, and just think about the poor dairy farms. And a lot of them are going out of business because of pressure from imports and pressures from the supermarkets, which obviously see milk as a staple, which should be as cheap as chips, and it's not doing us any good, I'm afraid. But also from proper management of the anaerobic digester, Emma will say a bit more about this, you get improved fertilizer savings distribution. Or one of our tame farmers reckons that they do save £13,000 a year in fertilizer from doing this. It really is a typical problem as well. Is the digestate, the residue that you get from the anaerobic digester is actually much easier to spread on the field and than cow poo. You've seen them go around, slinging muck everywhere. It's really is quite a an obscene practice. And in places like Wales, where the geography is sort of gives you farms on slopes leading into watercourses, it's a huge problem because you get rain, and if the slurry isn't distributed properly, it just runs off into the watercourse and pollutes it. So biogas is what comes off an anaerobic digester. So on the farm, this is 60% methane, 40% carbon dioxide, water, and trace hydrogen sulfide. So we can remove the water and the hydrogen sulfide using carbon recyclable filters, and the carbon dioxide can then also be mostly removed using permeable membranes or cryogenic technology. We do both, and it can be stored either as a gas or a liquid. Now over to Emma to talk a bit more about the economics.
Thanks, Tom. Just going to test my technical skills to see if I can take over. Okay, am I sharing? I feel like I'm sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, so Tom sort of outlined the problem in terms of fugitive methane, its impact to the atmosphere, its impact on climate change. He spoke a little bit about the opportunity, but I'm going to spend the rest of the talk actually talking about the opportunities that fugitive methane presents. And the thing that I absolutely love about innovation is that it gives us the ability to turn a problem into an opportunity. And that's what we've been doing at Bennaman, is trying to look at this fugitive methane and turn it into an opportunity for everybody involved. Now, the company itself, it started 11 years ago. And actually the problem we were trying to solve at that time had nothing to do with methane emissions. The co-founders were friends, they were surfing buddies based in Cornwall. As Tom said, grid infrastructure is challenging there. They were becoming more environmentally aware, and they wanted to find a way to take their homes off grid, reduce or eradicate reliance on fossil fuels, and just become micro-scale producers of renewable energy. So when they looked across the landscape at what was available, it was either prohibitively expensive, it was complex, there was no one-stop shop, comprehensive solution. And as Tom was saying earlier on, the intermittent supply of renewable energy is the problem. Time when demand is high, production can sometimes be low. When production is high, demand is low, and storage is always a challenging thing to overcome. So that was the starting point. They looked across to see what was there. There was nothing off the shelf they could just plug in and then they'd be powered by renewables. And at that point, one of the founders, Chris, went to the States and he came across the idea of using grass as a feedstock for an anaerobic digester. So as Tom was saying, anaerobic digestion is a process where you're breaking down organic material in the absence of oxygen. So he had quite extensive grass in his property. He wanted to use his grass clippings into a microscale digester and use that to power his home. He would get biogas as an output and some digestate. Problem solved, right? Not so much. So when he looked at what I'm calling the biomethane value chain, there were technical and commercial issues across each element of the value chain. And by value chain, I mean each step in a process that gets you from an input to an output. Every bit that adds value is a point in the value chain, hence the name. So the biomethane value chain is about capture. That's the first stage. So capturing and producing the biogas. Processing, as Tom was saying, you take out the CO2 and the nasties. Storage, which is a real issue for biomethane. Distribution, so that's getting it from the point of production to consumption, and then also consumption itself. So the technology and the equipment that's needed to actually generate energy from the biomethane. So the technical barriers for what I'm calling microscale producers, so really small producers, largely across the value chain, microscale technology did not exist, or it was really expensive. Anaerobic digesters were out there, but there were those, medium, large scale, those big beasts that you see, and they required grid access and a lot of capital investment. Storage of methane was an issue, and actually that was one of the big problems, because in order to move it efficiently and economically, it's much better if you can liquefy it, because you increase the energy density by a factor of 3, and you can move it around. One of the problems with moving liquid methane is that when you liquefy it, you do it cryogenically. So that's minus 150 degrees, but it always wants to be returning into gaseous form. So it's in a container, it's in liquid form, some sort of heat from the external environment starts to seep in, and the gas starts to boil off. And what happens is the pressure builds inside the container, and then at a point you have to let that gas out. So you have to vent it. So that causes two problems. One is you've just let all of that lovely fugitive methane that you spend time capturing back out to atmosphere, which is an environmental no-no. And then the other thing is, from an economic perspective, that's your product and you literally just had to throw it away. So that was a major stumbling block in terms of the biomethane value chain. And then another really important thing to note is that the demand side technologies, so, you know, heavy goods vehicles running on gas or sort of big vehicles, they couldn't offer the same performance at the same price point as fossil fueled alternatives. So lots of technical barriers. The market barriers were also quite significant. You just had the sort of medium and large scale on the supply side. There was nothing available for small scale producers. Demand side markets like transport didn't have sufficient infrastructure to encourage adoption. So if the likes of John Lewis wanted to start running their trucks on biomethane, there were limited amounts of, and there are some public biomethane fueling stations, but there are limited amounts. So a lot of times customers on the demand side would have to stump up the cost of the infrastructure themselves, and it would generally tend to be back to base type operations, which again limited its adoption on the demand side. Small scale producers just couldn't afford the high cost of equipment, and there was a lack of awareness at the micro scale side of the market across the demand and supply side. So lots and lots and lots of barriers. At the point where they formed in 2011, they got some funding from the ESA-BIC in Harwell, and they did a proof of concept on a storage concept that Chris had come up with. So his idea was you use the boil off gas to power a refrigeration cycle, and that keeps the methane cool inside the vessel, the container that it's in. And that does two things. It means you don't have to vent and you can store it indefinitely. But more than that, now you can move it around without needing to vent. So at that point, they had done the POC. They were looking for more sort of public investment in projects, and not a lot happened between 2012 and 2015, largely because of all of those sort of economic and technical barriers. In 2015, they widened the team. So they brought together myself, Tom, you know, cryogenics guru, and another chap called Derek Jenkins, who's also in Harwell. And he brought a wealth of experience. He'd worked on landfill AD. So he had that side of the sort of biomethane technology chain in terms of expertise to bring to the table. So from there, we got our first grant funded project, and it was based again on the storage concept and applying it to fuel tanks for heavy goods vehicles. We were working with Iveco, and we did a proof of concept on this low pressure liquid fuel tank for heavy goods vehicles. And that was the sort of starting point, as I say, to building out the sort of technology chain that we wanted to build across the value chain. So we started with the storage. That same year, we got a grant to do some processing. So we did a small scale processing, what we call a biocycle plant. So that's the bit that takes out the CO2 and makes pure biomethane. And in 2017, we did a proof of concept around AD, and it was a grass-fed microscale grass AD. So during that time, we started to mature our own thinking in terms of what we were going to bring to market. And this, you know, this initial concept of a microscale grass AD was great, but actually nobody in the marketplace knew about it or wanted it, which is always a problem from economic perspective. But what we did know was out there, we knew the farmers were out there. We knew that there were existing sets of customers on the supply side. So customers who were already generating fugitive methane through their business as usual activities, who could realize real value from a solution much quicker. So in 2019, we had sort of a major milestone as a business where we got our first commercial contracts. The first was with Cornwall Council, and they wanted us to deploy on 6 of their dairy farms. So the council themselves, they own 58 dairy farms in the county. And they're a perfect type of customer for us because they can both be supply side, so they're producing the fugitive methane, but also a demand side customer. They have a group of companies that look after highways and their estate. And between those group of companies, I think there's 1,100 vehicles. So they want to transition them all to low carbon vehicles. The smaller vehicles will be electrified. The larger vehicles, they want to run on the gas that they produce in their farms. So it's this lovely closed loop energy system. And the other commercial contract that we got was with Case New Holland Industrial, who are part of the same group as Iveco that we did the original storage project with back in 2016. So they saw what we had done with Iveco, and they really wanted us to do a similar thing with tractor fuel tanks. So similar to a HGV, the space envelope for the fuel tank is really small. If you can make a conformable fuel tank, you can actually get more fuel in there, which means you can start to get to a similar duty cycle as a petrol or diesel alternative. And that's when things started to get really exciting for us. We did that piece of work for them. We did a prototype, and they liked it so much that they became a minority investor last year in March. And as a startup company, and I mean, it's quite a long time we've been a startup company, but we've been doing a lot in that time. You know, cash is always great, but for us, it was much more about the strategic relationship that we were going to be building with them, their support to help us to industrialize the portfolio. And not just that, very much the opening of global channels to market was a really, really key thing for us and the relationship with Case New Holland. So this is essentially what our product portfolio looks like. As I say, we have been very busy over the last 6 years in particular. We have created a proprietary set of technology aimed at microscale producers. It actually can be scaled to any size, but that was our starting point, that capture, process, store, and distribute and consume fugitive methane. This is some pictures of our deployments in Cornwall to date. So this is where we are today. In the top right-hand corner, that lovely green balloon, for lack of a better description, is our covered slurry lagoon. So that's where the cow slurry gets channeled in there, the methane that comes off it gets captured. And then in the bottom left, that sort of burger van, for lack of a better description, beside the truck, is our processing technology, and it's mobile, which is really, really key. And what that means for microscale producers is that they can share the capital costs because it moves from farm to farm, upgrading the biomethane, which can then be used into tractors or heavy duty vehicles, or if you run it through a generator, you can use it to power EVs, which is another thing that we're doing. So you can see here in the middle picture, this is Case New Holland's first methane tractor, which they launched at the beginning of this year. So now it's, for the first time, a farmer can be energy independent. He or she can use the waste stream from the farm to power plant, machinery, to power the vehicles, and any excess gets sold into energy markets. Bennaman does that on behalf of the farmer. And as Tom was saying, we split the profits with them. So that enables small scale dairy farming in particular to be sustainable. You know, we've seen in the media what a hammering sort of livestock farming has had in recent times, just because of the environmental impact that they have, but because of the low margins, you know, it's impossible for them to really be able to mitigate their emissions up until now. We're also, as I said, we're doing a fugitive methane powered EV charger. And again, what that does is it gives off-grid rapid charging capability to be deployed anywhere. As I don't know whether you're aware or not, but most EVs, when they come off the production line, they have an additional 5 tons of carbon debt over a diesel alternative. So it takes, depending on the energy mix that's used to power it, it can take quite some time for them to write off that carbon debt. If the same EV is being fueled by carbon negative electricity, which is powered by fugitive methane, then it can write off that debt in a much quicker time frame. So we think that's a really exciting opportunity for us to move beyond sort of heavy goods vehicle transport fueling use cases. We're going to be deploying this solution, demonstrators, 3 of them in this year. So the maths of methane. This is what a 150 cow farm looks like before we're deploying anything. So you can see the emissions that come from, you know, piles of manure, uncovered slurry lagoons, the red diesel, the heating oil that's used to power the dairy, the red diesel that's powering the tractor, the enteric fermentation, which is really nothing that we can do about, but chemical fertilizers is certainly something that we can help to address. So this is the before. and this is the after. So we can mitigate a lot of the emissions that are coming from the farm, both in terms of, stopping fugitive emissions from getting there, displacing the fossil fuels that are used on site, and also some of the chemical fertilizers, which tend to be very carbon intensive as well. And then you're displacing into transport and heavy goods vehicles, those sort of sectors with the fuel. This is what the top line numbers look like. So a typical 150 cow farm will produce the equivalent of 4,400 tons of CO2 per annum. If they deploy our technology, you can reduce that by 2,500 tons. And if you then use that methane to displace fossil fuels, there's another 290 tons of CO2 equivalent savings there. So that's a total of 2,800 tons of CO2 equivalent per annum, which is the equivalent of 140 UK households' carbon footprints. And that's from one 150 cow dairy farm. There are 1.8 million cows in the UK alone. And they could, if we harnessed all of the fugitive methane that comes from their slurry, we could generate 800,000 tons of fugitive methane, which would give us the equivalent of 1.68 million UK households' carbon footprints abated. We could just wipe them off the balance sheet, which is 6% of UK households, and that's just cows. So as Tom was saying, there are lots of additional sources of fugitive methane, other livestock farms, landfill, food waste, sewage, and we can sell into a variety of energy markets. It's incredibly flexible as a form of energy, as Tom was saying. If you liquefy it, you can use it to replace diesel or petrol. You can use it as a straight out swap for grid gas, or you can run it through a generator to create carbon negative electricity. So our goal is to create local energy networks which match supply and demand. It's created locally and it's consumed locally, which is a real step change in energy systems. In terms of the maths of methane, well, the obvious subtraction is that we're taking fugitive methane from atmosphere. And this is really, it's point number one on the agenda in terms of addressing climate change. That came out in the latest IPCC report. That's why 105 countries, I think, at COP26 committed to cutting methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And this is a real solution that can enable us to get there, because both the economic and the environmental benefits work across the value chain. We're also removing utilization of fossil fuels, reliance on imported fuel and gas, and the volatile energy prices that we're all have started to feel, but are about to feel in a very, very real way over the coming 12 months. In terms of the subtraction and the additions that gives us, well, it gives us the opportunity to decarbonize sectors both on the supply and the demand side. So you're talking about decarbonization of agriculture, transport, energy, food, just to name a few. You're also looking at real economic and environmental sustainability for farming, which has been under threat increasingly over the last 20 years. And then finally, there's the opportunity to create closed loop energy economies where we create the value in region and we retain the value in region. So that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed it. A little bit of methane maths for you. I'll hand back over to Faith.
Hey, fantastic. Thank you both very much. Faith, I'll bring you in a second. I think that was a prize. I think it's a terrific story. And by the way, I think you're a great double act. So thank you very, very much indeed. Faith, I don't know about you, what back to Emma and Tom, I was thinking Faith is really good at curating questions. So
well, if we have any, yeah. But I have a couple myself, so stop. Yeah. But isn't this problem of it being stored at minus 150 still quite a limiting factor?
Not really. As I alluded early on, you've got, when the sun shines a lot and when the wind blows a lot, you've got an excess of electricity. And you can use that to process the methane into a liquid form and store it there. Now, there is a so-called power station in Cornwall called Indian Queens, which actually earns more from taking electrical energy off the grid than putting it on. It's because there's so many, you go around Cornwall, there's so many wind farms, you keep tripping over them. But the infrastructure doesn't allow you to take it off the peninsula. So Indian Queens, actually, there's a lot of spare energy around. So we can use that to liquefy the methane and use that through a generator, as I was saying, at a time when required. So it's acting as a battery.
Okay. I just have another quick question before. So if people could add their questions into the chat, please. I think we've got one, but just to say, have you been on Countryfile yet? I'm sure it would make a great story for them.
I wouldn't, Emma would. Yeah.
We haven't yet, Faith.
No.
I think there was a chat about it at some stage last year, but up until the investment with Case New Holland, we were very much operating in stealth mode because we were trying to develop so many pieces of proprietary technology. And also you're up against the sort of energy big boys, you know, so we wanted to try and stay under the radar as much as possible. It's only really in the last 12 months or so that we've started to do any PR or publicize what we're doing. But Countryfile is definitely in the pipe. It's definitely one that we'll be doing in the future.
Brilliant. There's a question from Alan Ruddle saying, is there also an opportunity producing methane from digesting household waste?
Yeah, absolutely. Food waste is definitely.
Yeah, I think you had that on the chart.
There's a slight problem with landfill sites and food waste and waste from the sewers, if you like, and that's because there's a lot of stuff called silanes in shampoos and things like that. Now, if you have a silanes and you run that through a generator, it can destroy the engine. So until there's a bit of legislation which takes silanes are just there just to improve the texture of shampoos and things like this. It's not really required. So till there's a bit of legislation, that's going to be slightly difficult unless you can put it through a burner, but running it through a combustion engine is a bit problematic.
I got the impression. Oh yeah, sorry.
No, pardon me. I was just interrupting and going to make an observation, Tom. I just can't let the thought get out of my head that some of your cryogenic friends and admirers would be a bit startled to recognize you as an expert in cow poo.
Well, you know, they'll also recognize that I'm great at shoveling, you know what, but lousy at making decisions. So,
there's a couple of further questions in the chat. What's the payback time for a new 150 cow farm to install and use this solution? Okay.
So it largely depends on a number of factors: how much time the cows are in the shed, how much the farmer wants to use on site, but typical payback is less than 5 years.
Okay, thank you.
That's a pessimistic case, I think, isn't it, Emma?
Yeah, significantly less.
Yeah, so, you know, yeah.
There's a query on Emma's talk from Serdar. You showed removal of CO2 from vehicles. Did you allow for the CO2 resulting from methane combustion? So
that's where the maths comes in. You know, if you're mitigating the equivalent of 86 kgs of CO2 by capturing one, when you burn that kg of methane, you do get 2.76, I think, back out, but still massively carbon negative. Okay. So what you've done so far is concentrated in Cornwall with Cornwall County Council. Are you targeting any other I don't know, where there's a conglomeration of dairy farms or beef farms? Or... Yes, absolutely. At the moment, Faith, we're about TRL 6, a technology readiness level 6. So that is, TRL 1 is I have an idea, TRL 9 is I have a product that's fully formed and in a customer's hand. So even though we're deploying on farm sites, some of the technology chain is around TRL 6 or 7, and that's where the industrialization with CNHI is really, you know, going to expedite our journey to get to TRL 9. We do have about 3 or 4 commercial farms in the pipeline currently now, and we have another, I think, 7 coming through next year, but we're not taking on any new farms until we finish that commercialization process. So we have a passive pipeline that's building and building, and we'd like to be able to go out there and offer it to customers, but in terms of the technology readiness, we're not quite there yet. But in answer to the question, absolutely. Farming networks are really interested. The likes of RODAs or companies that deal with networks of farmers are very interested in the solution. So that is the sort of early adopter segment for us, is multi-farm, either owners or networks.
Okay, Alan Ruddle has a comment about SF6, widely used in all large switchgear, including wind and solar farms.
And Alan does know about switchgear.
Okay. As Tom pointed out, it's also a highly potent greenhouse gas. However, it is sealed in the switchgear, and by law, leaks must be detected in the SF6
Yes.
recovered after the switchgear end of life. Alternatives are being developed and are becoming available.
Yeah.
Okay.
Alan, in defense of switchgear.
Question from Phil, who has given some talks himself. What's the technical regulatory situation with feeding a percentage biomethane into the UK gas grid?
So we can feed it into the grid, and the purity is of sufficient quality, but it needs to have some propane added in there in order to meet the specification of the grid gas. But it's perfectly doable. People are doing it now.
But it's economically not really worth it for us.
Not for microscale producers, because of the access to the grid. The economics in accessing the grid is just prohibitive for microscale producers. But we probably will look at a hub and spoke eventually when we start to build sufficient momentum in a specific area, but not right now. Okay.
Damien has a question, I think.
Hi. Back in the 90s, I managed the anaerobic digestion program at Harwell as part of ETSU, and I followed the technology right the way through. In the 2000s, the anaerobic digesters on farms were well supported through the feed-in tariff scheme, where they were being used to generate electricity. Those digesters are quite sophisticated in terms of their control, the stirring, the blend of feedstocks and so on. Are you not just repeating the same technology as they have used, apart from the end use part of it?
Yes.
And
yeah, I mean, you're quite right. I mean, AD is not new. They used, in India, for example, they used to have every village had its own AD, system. It's just it's an art that's been forgotten and put by the, if it was making money and being useful, every farm would have one. And the idea behind Bennaman is to make it useful, by making it economically viable.
But is your anaerobic digestion technology any different to the ones that have been established and used on farms over the last decades?
Do you want to take that, Emma, or shall I?
You go for it.
Well, basically, we have labs here where we're looking at the different digesters. The AADs themselves, are quite sort of sensitive things. They are a digestive system, so it's very easy to say, oh, just bung stuff into an anaerobic digester and get the methane off. Well, if you change the feedstock for an anaerobic digestion system, it burps, it gets dyspepsia and stops producing for a while till the microbes sort of develop. But if you're involved in that program, you know exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. So by targeting sort of the cow segment and then other segments of the grass separately, I think we can make it economic. But it's the economic drivers that's the unique thing here, not the AD system. And I think you're right in saying that. We're just finding it again as a technology.
Yeah, I would say one of the key differences to our covered lagoons is that it's a two-stage system. So you've got the processing that's happening underneath, but then there's a gas bubble that sits on top. Yep. So the gas bubble is used to store the biogas until the biocycle plant can come along and process it. So in that way, it's slightly different. And that offers a number of benefits in terms of economics, because you can just store it in the lagoon itself until you're ready to process it. So it's not vastly different. there's a pump room that pushes the slurry in and out, does the stirring by the pumping, but I don't think there's anything truly magical or innovative about the AD. As Tom was saying, it's a low-cost version. It's as cheap as possible. It's aimed at the micro scale, and that's really what it is. It's just part of that value chain. And it's optimized for our business model.
I mean, the point Emma's making there is that because the lagoon that we've developed can store the gas, the farmer doesn't actually need to own the liquefaction or purification equipment. Mm-hmm. It stores enough gas to last a week, and the idea is you bring the purification system to the farm once a week, purify it, take it away on a lorry, and the lorry goes to the next farm. So the capex cost of making it economically viable is actually very low. That's why the payback time is low. 3 to 5 years for something like this is really very short.
And I was just going to say, It sounds like you've really tuned the dials on the business model in Bennaman in a really admirable way. And we should say congratulations on getting that investment from Case New Holland. Well done.
Okay, I think we're perhaps out of questions. There is a question about whether there's much scope to actually reduce the payback time further, even though people think it's quite good, actually.
I have another one after that phase.
Yeah, I mean, there is scope to reduce it. As I say, it depends on what the farmer is going to do with the fugitive methane. If they want to use a lot of it on site, then the payback is longer. If they want to sell everything they have into a transport market, which it attracts a premium in terms of a price point, then the payback will come down to sort of the 3-year mark. But 3 to 5 years in the agricultural sector as a payback is, I think, pretty attractive. Farmers are used to sort of big capital investments and having to pay them back over longer periods of time than that. So, I think it's a perfectly reasonable payback, especially for a small scale producer. And
Ken also asked how much the capital outlay is.
Well, so that depends on whether or not we've got 2 different types of lagoon. One is you build a brand new lagoon, which we call the option 1, which is more expensive. Another that we're working on at the moment is a retrofit. So we just fit a cover over an existing lagoon. But in terms of the overarching, I'll give you a ballpark of about 200,000, but it depends on the size of the farm, the size of the lagoon, whether it's retrofit or not, and how many farms are sharing the processing equipment as well.
That's just a bit more than the cost of a tractor, isn't it? It's that sort of,
Okay, John, you wanted to ask a question?
Well, actually, we ought to reach out to our honoured guest from Germany, Andrea, and ask if he's got any questions as well. But meantime, just to share a little anecdote with you, I have, in a glamorous part of my life, I have shared a tour of slurry bits on a local farm with Tom. How good does that get?
That's hard to beat.
Wonderful. It was the pub afterwards that attracted you, John.
I thought we went to the pub before, but maybe I'm getting mixed up. The question I wanted to put to Tom, if I'm not mistaken, when the H word for hydrogen comes on your screen, I think I've heard you react negatively to hydrogen.
Well, it's not negative. I mean, hydrogen's a decent enough fuel, but it's not naturally found. It's a battery. It's not a fuel. You've got to put quite a bit of energy into to actually break the hydrogen from, say, water, if you're doing creating it that way. And I did the sum the other day about taking the energy from a wind turbine through a what do you call this? That's a good one, isn't it? Through to produce to split the hydrogen and oxygen molecules. Electrolyzer. It's getting late in the day. Through an electrolyzer, and then storing that as a liquid, and then using that as a fuel. And really, the the efficiency there is awful, really awful. You know, you'd have to be pretty desperate to do it that way.
Interesting.
Okay. And
Andrea?
any other?
I'm here. Hi.
Hi, Andrea.
Got any
Tom.
hard questions?
No hard questions. I had some curiosities because I'm not entirely new in the technological field, so I can picture how you filter, liquefy, purify. But I was wondering whether you had any pictures on the first part, the options for collecting.
Oh, the lagoon.
Yeah.
I think you had a picture, didn't you?
I do, yeah.
Yes.
Bear with me.
Basically, conventionally, a farmer would dig a pit and you know, obviously fill it with slurry. And what we've got here, if you look on top right, you can see that sort of pit is covered, and it's actually very gas tight, so that we get the pure biogas from the lagoon there.
And then as the gas starts to build, obviously the bubble the gas sits on top and it inflates.
Yeah.
So it's quite deflated in this picture, but it inflates to store the gas as it's being produced.
Is that just a single farm?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Well, yeah, so this is one of the 6 farm pilots. This is another farm where we're trialing the tractor. This here is a different farm. It's a commercial farm. It's actually our proving ground Chinoa farm here on the left. So there's actually 3 different farms there.
Okay.
You can see the size of the lagoon now, and that farm is that 130 cows? Is it
120.
120 cows? You know,
Yeah.
it's a big pond. You know, just to store the. You can see the cow sheds at the back here with a few cow heads poking out, and what generally happens is they do what comes naturally, and then there are sort of like scrapers which pull it into a holding tank, and then that's pumped into the lagoon.
Do the tanks on the tractors have to be at minus 150 degrees?
For liquid, yeah.
Yeah, but this is a compressed. This picture in the
That
middle.
one's a compressed one.
Compressed.
Yeah.
It's a compressed.
I may have a picture somewhere of the one running off liquid methane, but then that actually has a cryostat bolted to the side of the tractor in place of the diesel tank. I mean, you wouldn't walk up to it and recognize would say it's a, you know, it's a different tractor. It looks very similar. It's a very strange shaped cryostat, but you know, you wouldn't. It doesn't look any different to a normal one.
Emma, am I right thinking you're based on Harwell campus?
That's correct. Yeah.
Do you have any call or contact or have use for the Miracle Company, who I believe are kind of specializing in detecting fugitive methane?
I didn't realize there was somebody on site doing that. Absolutely. John, that would be really useful to be in contact with them. If you wouldn't mind passing me the details, that'd be great.
I just saw recently, to my surprise, actually, I mean, I know they can spot methane from the sky or whatever, and they have been focusing up until now, I think, on maybe hydrocarbon installations, but recently they've come into play with farming and agriculture, and I think possibly triggered by the sort of new food strategy that was published towards the end of last year.
Okay.
Yeah, we've had a firm at least one of the farms looking at any methane leakage from the lagoon covers, which I think is similar to what you've described, John. Yeah, very useful.
Yeah, definitely be of interest.
I'll follow that up tomorrow with you, Emma. Actually, Faith, one thing I really enjoyed in Tom's slides and presentation was the molecular description of greenhouse gases. That was kind of new to me.
Yeah, that was clever. Yeah.
Maybe I've missed it elsewhere, but thank you for that.
That's good.
I will say it's a very simplified, model,
Yes.
description of the greenhouse effect.
I like simple.
We like simple.
Yes.
There's a question about, so what happens in summer when the cows are out on pasture? Because presumably you can't collect all the dung then.
Yeah. So they're dairy cows, so they spend 25% in the shed anyway of milking time. So between the winter and the 25% that they spend being milked, most farms will be, well, most cows will be between 6 and 7 months we'll have of shed-based inputs, feedstock, shall we say. So that is what that is. It's just what we collect when they're being milked and when they're being housed for the winter.
I guess
it's quite funny, actually. Yeah, sorry, we're talking to one of the farmers. The cows don't like being outside. They'd much rather be in. It's the supermarkets that want them to be outside for a certain They don't like it. They prefer to be in the shed.
It's a bit worrying. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I guess that's the case for moving to the really high input intensive cow rearing systems where they never see the light of day.
No, we do not want that, Faith.
No. Good.
Whether they're happy or not, they need to be out in the field. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, I agree. And Ken says, actually, is any collection done from the open fields?
No.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other questions?
By the way, there was another brilliant takeaway, I think, in your talk, Tom, when you equated a patch of grass to gallons of gas.
1 square meter of grass will produce as much energy in a year as a litre of petrol.
Fantastic. Fascinating.
So it's worth doing,
Yeah.
Shall we draw things to a close, Faith?
I think so, yes. Thank you. Unless anyone else has anything, but I think that's probably it.
Well, thank you for listening.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. It was a really entertaining and informative talk.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Really brilliant. Thank you so much. And I suppose, Faith, we should just give a little trailer for what's to come.
So next time, we think we'll be back in Wildwood. I think we just have to look at the newsletter and see what's happening and things. But at the moment, the plan is to be back in Wildwood and cinema, and that Camilla Burrow, who is, I think, the head of Wild Oxfordshire, is that right, John? Will be talking about how we can all help to achieve nature's recovery across Oxfordshire. So I think it's about sort of working in partnership and what can be done at different levels.
And by the way, word of warning to Emma and Tom, when word gets out about this talk, Café Scientifique all over the network are going to be after you. What's his space? No, it's fantastic. Really, really great. I have one favor to ask. In those slides, Tom, it was you actually who highlighted it. You said that the schematic of a cow looked like not a very happy cow.
Well, that particular one, yeah.
Can you
personalities.
Can you not find a happy cow drawing?
That's just with our graphics provider team stuff, so it's got to go with what we're given.
Should have asked for happy cows.
Happy cows.
Hey, thank you both so much. Really, really great. I'm sure everybody really ears pricked up, tuned in very much to what you're doing. A round of applause from Ken even. So you really have one out tonight. So thank you very, very much indeed. And look forward to seeing you soon.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Alistair, forgive me. I think I've just seen a message from you saying, should I press stop on record?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Good. It's just the two of us and Stephen Burke. Oh, and he's gone. Okay. Well, when you stop the recording, you'll get an email in half an hour or so. And if you
Okay.
just send that to me, then I'll deal with it. And if I have any trouble, I'll let you know.